Continue with our next panel. For those tuning into today's meeting, it explores Bill C-21, an act to amend certain acts and to make certain consequential amendments respecting firearms. For this next hour, we have the pleasure of welcoming from Alberta's Chief Firearms Office, Dr. Teri Bryant, Chief Firearms Officer, and from the Saskatchewan Firearms Secretariat, Robert Freberg, Commissioner and Chief Firearms Officer. Thank you, Dr. Bryant and Mr. Freberg, for joining us today. I invite you to present your opening remarks, to be followed by questions from our members, and I remind you that you each have 5 minutes for your testimony. We will begin with Dr. Bryant whenever you're ready.
Thank you for inviting me to appear today. Bill C-21 is misguided. Its burden falls overwhelmingly on already heavily regulated law-abiding firearms owners, and it is premised on the prohibition of specific types of firearms, a failed approach to reducing violence. If this bill cannot be abandoned, it requires, at a minimum, significant amendment. All Canadians should oppose this bill in its current form, whether they own or even like firearms. Those most directly affected by this bill are, of course, law-abiding firearms owners. This bill will effectively put an end to many long-established, safe, internationally recognized target shooting sports by cutting off the flow of new entrants.
Dr. Bryant, could you just slow down a little bit to assist with our interpretation?
Okay, sure.
Thank you.
Well, I'm passionate about these topics, and I get excited, and I want to go fast. Even those sports that use single-shot, muzzle loading, black powder, flintlock pistols, a Pirates of the Caribbean-era technology over 200 years old, will die away. This loss will have no conceivable public safety benefit. For many individuals and communities, these sports are an important part of their heritage. They also serve to socialize new firearms owners into the safe and responsible use of firearms as a group activity. If we allow this bill to shrink the pool of handgun owners, membership in shooting ranges will shrink, putting their economic viability at risk. Hunters and others who rely on these ranges to practice will be left without a safe place to shoot. Firearms businesses and the many thousands of hard-working Canadians they employ will also be gravely affected. The handgun transfer freeze, combined with the Order in Council of May 2020, have eroded much of the market that sustains these mostly small, family-owned businesses. Many are barely hanging on, and some have already been forced to close. Canadians concerned about protecting citizens from injustice should be gravely concerned. Even if ultimately found innocent after an accusation that results in revocation of their handgun registrations, the prohibition on the issuance of new handgun registration certificates will prevent individuals from recovering their previous privileges. If there are flaws in Canada's procedures for removing firearms from those who should not have them, these flaws are not in a lack of powers for CFOs to do so, but in the resources most CFOs have available to apply these powers. Canadians concerned with property rights should be gravely concerned by the hundreds of millions of dollars of lawfully acquired property that has been rendered effectively unsaleable at any reasonable price. Already, thousands of handguns worth many millions of dollars are stuck in estates, prevented from finding willing buyers by the regulatory freeze on handgun transfers. Many historic artifacts and cherished family heirlooms may end up being needlessly destroyed. Because the precipitous imposition of the handgun transfer freeze overwhelmed the transfer processing system in the months between the announcement and the imposition of the freeze, many who wanted to sell their handguns as an estate planning measure were unable to do so. These financial consequences are manifestly unjust. Canadians concerned about public safety should be gravely concerned because this measure will do nothing to enhance public safety and will undermine it in ways large and small. Many individuals whose acquisition of a handgun could enhance public safety will be prevented from acquiring the equipment they need, such as instructors teaching the Canadian Restricted Firearms Safety course. Many smaller police forces and security companies will find the ranges where they practice will close. Our firearms control system is already riddled with inconsistencies and really needs to be redesigned from scratch. Yet C-21 would further worsen this confusion by defining prohibited long guns based on date of manufacture rather than any proven objective criteria. It will also centralize life and death decisions on authorizations to carry in the Commissioner of Firearms, an official far too removed from the field to make timely, informed decisions. These measures will undermine confidence in our firearms control system at precisely the time when everyone's efforts should be focused on strengthening societal confidence in our institutions. For all these reasons, and many more, I hope that the honourable senators will initiate a thorough review of this deeply flawed legislation and abandon it, or at least amend it significantly to strengthen public safety, allow legitimate shooting sports to continue, and depoliticize this issue so we can all return to the hard daily work of ensuring maximum public safety. I and my staff stand ready to assist with more detailed support in this effort to ensure that what emerges from your process of sober second thought is a bill that all Canadians deserve, one that protects public safety in a measured and balanced way. Maintenant, je serai ravi de répondre à vos questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bryant. Over now to Mr. Freberg, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Honourable Senators, thank you for the invitation to appear before this committee as it studies Bill C-21. Given the complexity of firearms legislation and regulations, I've also brought with me Blaine Beavan, our senior legal team from Saskatchewan, who can provide me some guidance when we get into questions because of the complexity of the legislation. The Saskatchewan Firearms Office mandate is to promote firearms safety and ensure that Saskatchewan firearms community has a strong voice on these important issues. The office has jurisdiction over the licensing, storing, transportation, carrying, and use of firearms in the province. The office also focuses on intensive public education and community outreach to citizens about safe firearm use, storage, and transportation. We have now expanded from our original mandate to include the establishment and operation of the new provincial ballistics lab to provide a timely testing system for law enforcement to also conduct prosecutions of offences under the Saskatchewan Firearms Act and manage the Provincial Firearms Compensation Committee. The Government of Saskatchewan strictly enforces the Federal Firearms Act and holds accountable those that do not comply. Revocations and refusals of firearms licenses in the provinces have increased threefold since Saskatchewan assumed administration of the Federal Firearms Act in September of 2021. However, the Government of Canada is yet to compensate the province at all for any of the costs of approximately $5 million to date, all the costs incurred in the administration of the Federal Firearms Program currently. The province, however, does budget upwards of $8 million per year now that we've taken over and we're now the Saskatchewan Firearms Office to administer the Federal Firearms Act, oversee the Provincial Ballistics Lab, prosecute offences, and advocate on behalf of licensed firearms owners. In Saskatchewan, a significant proportion of firearms used in criminal activity are illegally acquired firearms. For example, firearms may be stolen and used to commit further crimes, but generally these are not handguns or restricted or prohibited firearms. Rather, they are predominantly non-restricted or firearms that have been modified or home-built. Legal firearm owners have an important role to play, of course, in enhancing public safety, which is why Saskatchewan is focusing a great deal of effort on public education to ensure safe storage, licensing, and use of firearms. Properly storing firearms can prevent firearms of any kind from getting into the wrong hands and enhance public safety greatly. Banning and seizing firearms is not the solution. This fact has been overwhelmingly proven over and over again in many studies and in other countries who have taken similar action as our current federal government is looking at. Comparing Canada to the United States statistically is not appropriate, as they do not have the very regimented laws that currently exist in Canada regarding licensing, mandatory training, safe storage, and effective regulatory frameworks. Generally, as a rule, CFOs across Canada have had little or no consultation whatsoever on firearms legislation and need to be directly involved as the frontline regulators enforcing these regulations. And I should say enforcing, but providing the regulatory framework. Unfortunately, the announcement of this proposed legislation and subsequent OACs has actually dramatically increased inquiries from our stakeholders and therefore actually negatively impacted our agency's ability to perform our primary duties and related public safety investigations with absolutely no financial resources or otherwise being provided by the federal government or any other provincial CFO agency. This legislation expects and trusts law-abiding firearms owners to voluntarily turn their handguns for destruction without compensation, potentially after multiple decades of safe and legal ownership, storage, and use. Ironically, this legislation does not trust those same owners now to engage in the commerce of purchasing and selling handguns between each other. While Bill C-21 has been studied by the House of Commons, it was made clear that there was no intention to provide compensation for the destruction of handguns. In Saskatchewan, however, the Saskatchewan Firearms Act, which has been recently passed, mandates that where the federal government seeks to expropriate handguns or any other firearms, which includes the ones in Bill C-21, and renders them of no value, that the fair market price must be paid by the federal government prior to their destruction. Police agencies should not be in the business of seizing firearms from law-abiding firearms owners, but dealing exclusively with those individuals or criminal organizations who use firearms illegally. Police resources across Canada are so limited as it is, and such seizures should not be their priority. Bill C-21, if passed, would enact a slow ban on handguns and would codify the current prohibition that was regulated without notice in October of 2022. Which prohibits the transfer of handguns between licensed individuals in most circumstances. As a result, handgun owners will have almost no other financial opportunities to recover their investment. An option currently legally available to those owners is to simply sell the component parts of the firearm, that is, the components that do not contain the registration or serial number of the firearm, which can easily be sold to another licensed individual or business. In some cases, it's been reported that the individual components being stripped are actually potentially fetching a higher price than assembled firearms. Mr. Chair, I believe that to better safeguard firearms transfers and ownership, the chief firearms officers in each province should be permitted to transfer existing registration certificates for handguns between licensed owners. This would maintain the overall value of firearms and serve to reduce the potential of parting out or existing handguns for compensation that frankly could be possibly diverted into legal 3D manufactured firearms. Further, this would potentially mitigate the risk of handguns from estates being diverted to an unlicensed individual, as they are not easily traced once the owner is deceased. By the time that law enforcement or the Canadian Firearms Program or our CFO offices become aware of this occurring, it can take up to 5 years of time for that have actually passed when the person's license expires. Because we only find out then that the person has been deceased when they're come up for renewal. As the law presently stands, individuals who possess firearms through the operation of an estate do not actually need a firearms license to dispose of the firearm, but do require the authorization that they must seek out with limited options to realize the value of an estate asset. There is a risk for illegal sales of firearms. Licensed firearms owners simply are not the problem and represent a minimal risk to themselves and others. The sports they compete in are highly regulated, including the purchase, sale, transportation, use, and storage of these firearms. The shooting ranges they're using for target practice are approved by the CFO under the Canadian Firearms Program. These same facilities are shared by law enforcement daily and will certainly cease to be in existence if the recreational firearms community is no longer able to support them through membership and usage fees. This will have a very negative impact on law enforcement agencies across Canada who heavily rely on these for training. To conclude, Mr. Chair, Saskatchewan is always supportive of gun control legislation that continues to improve public safety. Any proposed legislation must balance the privileges currently provided to responsible law-abiding firearms owners with strict enforcement and accountability for those that commit violent criminal offenses involving firearms. Significant studies should be undertaken on Bill C-21 to determine if it's legislation if it's appropriate to be even passed, and to determine if the potential cost is appropriate compared to minimal deliveries on public safety. There is also the increased workload of police services in dealing with surrendered handguns with minimal resources that they already have. The Saskatchewan Firearms Office and our team is prepared to assist in any way possible with the study of Bill C-21. And I must tell you, I'm very committed to public safety, and I'm very proud of what our firearms officers do every day alongside law enforcement to make Saskatchewan a safer place. We've also partnered with many Indigenous communities to develop safety programs where we're embedding firearms officers in their communities to help increase licensing and compliance. So we're very proud of what we're doing in Saskatchewan. And thank you so much for the opportunity to share that with you today.
Thank you, Mr. Freberg. We will now proceed to questions. We have an hour to move through this session. And in order to ensure that each member is able to participate fully, we're going to stay with 4 minutes for the questions and answers. It would help if you keep your questions succinct and identify the person you're addressing the question to. The first question goes to our Deputy Chair, Senator Dagenet, and also on the list currently are Senators Platt, Deakin, Ontario, Arnott, Boisvenu, and Duncan. Over to you, Senator Dagenet.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Merci à nos témoins. Ma première question va être pour la Dr. Bryant. Dr. Bryant, vous avez bien établi les dommages sportifs de C-21, mais on aimerait vous entendre sur d'autres aspects du projet de loi. Avez-vous des statistiques de votre province qui nous diraient dans quelle proportion les crimes commis en Alberta le sont avec des armes qui sont illégales et qui, de toute façon, n'auraient jamais été enregistrées? Et pouvez-vous nous dire en quoi le projet de loi C-21 devient un avantage ou un outil pour mieux lutter contre le crime organisé qui, lui, n'utilise pas des armes légales? Puis qu'est-ce qui pourrait effrayer les membres des gangs organisés?
Merci pour ces questions. Malheureusement, je crois qu'il n'y a pas de bonnes statistiques au Canada pour établir une réponse précise à vos questions sur la proportion des armes à feu qui proviennent de sources domestiques ou étrangères et tous ces aspects du problème. Mais en général, c'est une question très, très importante et c'est pourquoi dans la croissance de notre bureau, on a établi une unité pour répondre, pour analyser les données et nous aurons un spécialiste en statistique bientôt pour répondre à ces questions. Jusqu'à maintenant, je crois que c'est peut-être le plus grand problème dans la création d'une bonne politique envers les armes à feu.
Merci. Ma seconde question est pour M. Freberg. M. Freberg, sur le plan politique et social, j'aimerais savoir comment le projet de loi C-21 est reçu par les chasseurs et ceux qui font du tir sportif en Saskatchewan. Vous avez sûrement dans vos dossiers des armes de poing bien enregistrées par des tireurs sportifs qui, eux autres, se conforment à la loi. Donc, à part les athlètes qui auront des droits spéciaux, nous dit le ministre, qu'arrivera-t-il à ceux qui font du tir sans faire de la compétition?
It faded a little bit at the end, the last part of your question, so I'll do my best to answer. So in Saskatchewan, we have 115,000 licensed PAL, normal, I call non-restricted firearms holders, license holders. And we have about 65,000 of those that have RPALs, so they have the ability to purchase handguns that are used, for sport shooting, because that's their primary purpose. We can't use them for hunting and other purposes under provincial hunting regulations and federal legislation. But the feedback that we're getting, we attend all, for the most part, as the CFO Bryant, we go to the gun shows and speak with the stakeholders, and there's no support for this. And the main reason for it is that many of the firearms that are categorized in there, there's been a lot of focus put on the AR-15. In Saskatchewan, we have about 1,200 AR-15s that exist that are registered in the province. They're a registered firearm. And they have not been used in any kind of a criminal manner. We haven't had one single case where the AR-15 has been utilized. And I'm not even aware that there's that many in Canada across the board, other than the one that the tragedy in Nova Scotia, I believe, which was illegally acquired and smuggled from the U.S. But as from registered owners, it's non-existent. The handgun shooters, for the most part, the only place they can discharge a handgun is on a licensed range. So they all buy memberships in their local clubs. They support their local wildlife federations, who buy habitat land, they build trout ponds, they mentor youth on hunter safety programs, all types of safety programs, and they also deliver safety courses. And with the handguns going away, a lot of the new people coming into the sport are purchasing handguns and getting the training. So by taking that away, we've also lost the ability to maintain instructors. So those same instructors teach the regular PAL course as well. And frankly, I mean, we're losing instructors at a very fast pace because some of our older instructors are leaving and we can't get new ones to come in. And they can't even instruct the handgun course because they can't even buy handguns to even use and deactivate for the purposes of training. So it's devastating across the province. Also, you know, ADM Tucklaw was saying that, well, we're not affecting hunters or ranchers with these firearms. The Mini 14, for example, which is one of the firearms that's restricted, and it was used, you know, terrible, terrible tragedy in Quebec and other places, but that firearm is very predominant in Saskatchewan for hunting coyotes. It's also very, in a different variation, is very common in Indigenous communities, as is the SKS rifle that was originally on the list that came off because there wasn't consultation done, and they're a very popular firearm in Indigenous communities. But again, they do have a bad reputation because there has been tragedies committed with them. The whole purpose is to make sure that the people holding them are licensed, that we've got some governance over them, and that they're being trained, and that they're being responsible with locking up their firearms. And so since I've started with the government of Saskatchewan, we've put an immense effort into that. And I think we're one of the few provinces that have actually in the process of moving a MOU forward with Indigenous partners to actually get the licensing up. Because we have communities in the north, we have 1,600 people in a community with 12 licensed individuals. Well, there's a lot more sustenance hunting going up there than 12 people are not feeding 1,600 people in their community. But we need to go and work with them to get a solution.
Mr. Freberg, thank you. I've allowed this to go over time because it's a question on the minds of many of our members around the table. So thanks very much. Thank you. We go to Senator O next, followed by Senator Platt.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, witnesses, for being here. My question is for both of you. As you will know, under the red flag provision of this bill, anyone can go to the court and ask a judge to seize the gun or suspend the license of a person who owns a gun if they believe that they pose a threat to anyone else or themselves. But the criminal justice section of the Canadian Bar Association has said the following: the current law contains sufficient powers to accomplish the goal of seizing weapons believed to have been used in a crime or removing them from the hands of a person who are believed to be a danger to themselves or others. This provision will impact the fire officers across the country. What consultations did the federal officers have with each of your office in relation to this provision before the bill was introduced?
Well, I can answer that very quickly and save us time. No consultation whatsoever.
There you go. There you go.
And I'll save some time too for my longer-winded discussion. It was zero. And you're very correct in that the 117 public safety orders can be used by the police, or the CFOs have the authority to do that. The issue is having the people there. And Mr. Bevan has been in our office. We have two lawyers that actually, we reach out to law enforcement partners to promote the fact that they should be utilizing these 117 tools and so forth. Because many times they'll go to a home where there's domestic violence. They're not even looking for the PAL. They're not even talking about firearms. Then we see the FIP or the charge on there and find out that this person has a lot of firearms, and we're actually having the police go back in there to seize firearms or take the PAL, well, because we're now prohibiting the individual from having a firearm. So you can bring in this legislation, but as I indicated earlier, you need to have the funding in place and the mechanism in place to make sure that our frontline officers and the firearms officers have the ability to go out and take these firearms. I mean, when we took over in Saskatchewan, we had people we had files that were 800 days old that hadn't been looked at. We had files where they were sending out a letter to the gun owner saying you can't have your gun anymore. Well, he's not in compliance with the law anyway. He's probably not even checking his mailbox, and then 30 days later you go and say, well, where's the gun? I don't know, I gave it to somebody. So we need to do more to make sure whatever laws we have in place, whether it's these new ones in C21 or the existing ones that we had before, that we're actually using the tools and that we're providing the support to the firearms offices across Canada and the law enforcement partners to get the firearms away from the people that shouldn't have the firearms so we don't see these tragedies.
Thank you very much, Senator Platt. Very quickly, about 45 seconds.
If this bill passed, do you believe that the gun club business will went straight down and a lot of instructors will be losing their jobs?
I don't believe it. It's happening already, Senator. I mean, we're losing a club that I was president of before I took this job had 3,000 members. They're down to 2,000 members. Their primary supporters were handgun sport shooters. And that was a family activity. It's not, there's, you know, husbands, wives, kids, lots of people out there participating. And it's, I can understand when people look at the violence in the streets of Toronto, but it's not the same situation in Saskatchewan or Alberta where it's target shooting or it's sport shooting. And I want to just mention that, you know, it was, well, we're
Afraid out of time.
thank you.
Senator Platt.
Thank you, Chair. Well, I'm not a gun owner. I used to be a gun owner. And 30 years ago, there was another Liberal government that passed a bill called C-68, which imposed a long gun registry, and many of us remember that. That initiative was a complete and colossal failure and wasted about $2 billion on a long gun registry, which ultimately had to be repealed because it had no support from firearms owners. I, at that time, gave my guns away because I didn't want to bother with it. And I wasn't really a hunter. I was a bit of a sport shooter, and so I gave them away. But that's not my question. My question to both of you is a very similar question. Dr. Bryant, Alberta government has introduced Bill 8, which allows the Alberta government to establish regulations to prevent municipalities and municipal police services from cooperating with the federal government on any measures that negatively impact firearms owners. Saskatchewan has enacted the Saskatchewan Firearms Act, which, among other things, establishes licensing requirements for seizure agents involved in possible firearms expropriations. It is a clear response to the federal government's arbitrary gun ban of 2020. So my question to both of you is I would like your perspective on the impact of such provincial legislation on the offices like both of yours, which are then put between potentially contradictory federal and provincial legislation. And how do you see this playing out in the years ahead? Dr. Bryant, maybe, and then Mr. Freberg. Thank you.
Thank you. So you're very right that the Alberta government has taken legislative action to protect the interests of firearms owners and public safety. The point of this legislation is not to block the federal government in the legitimate exercise of its discretion in its areas of jurisdiction. The point of this legislation is that many of the ideas that they were putting forward could actually have negatively affected public safety. And so our legislation is intended to ensure that whatever the federal government does, and we will oppose their ideas in the court of public discussion, but if they actually do proceed to do something like this, then we will make sure, that their actions do not pose a risk to the Alberta society at large. So, for example, if they are going to have some kind of procedure to confiscate guns, a measure which we do not support, if they insist on doing that, then we will make sure that it is done in a fashion that doesn't expose the Alberta public to unnecessary risk. And we will also make sure that any compensation is full and adequate and prompt, so that if these unfortunate measures are pushed through, that we will protect the interests both of the society at large in Alberta and of firearms owners in particular with respect to compensation.
Thank you, Dr. Bryant. Mr. Freberg.
Yes, and I won't repeat a lot of what Dr. Bryan has indicated because Saskatchewan has a similar approach. I mean, when this whole thing came out with the OAC initially, and now the handgun slow ban, there really hasn't been a strong plan put together on the actual confiscation process. I mean, we've seen from situations, well, we'll just take them down, people take them to the post office and ship them back somewhere. Well, our post offices are in rural Saskatchewan or a hardware store, and it's certainly not secure to leave a bunch of firearms there. Second side is, well, the compensation. We've looked at the initial offers of compensation, and they're woefully inadequate. And then there's also all the accessories that people bought for these firearms that have no value, so that we feel that should be taken into account. And then the third side of it is, we don't believe that firearms, and I've heard the use at this Senate hearing all the time of weapons. I'm sorry, we call them firearms. They're weapons when they're used criminally. They're not weapons until they're used in a criminal manner. But when these firearms are supposedly such a high risk to public safety, well, then we shouldn't be just chopping them up until we've done a ballistic test on them, which is one of the reasons why Saskatchewan has gone and built, and in the process of building its own provincial ballistics lab. Because currently police forces take up to 18 months to get a firearm that's used in a crime even analyzed. But we feel it's important before we destroy the firearm to make sure that we take a digital signature of it in case it was used in a crime, because a criminal could turn it in, get paid money for it, and then turn around and we chop it up for him. I mean, what a great system. So we just wanted to put some control in there. So we're not there to block the federal government. We're there just to make sure that it gets done properly and that we're doing it in a manner that makes good business sense.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Probably won't be a second round, but if there is.
So, we have 7 senators on the list: Senator Deakin, Ontario, Senators Arnott, Boisvenu, Duncan, Beam, Youssef and Kuchar. So we will have to be very disciplined, colleagues. Senator Deakin, Ontario.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the three of you for being here today. I'd like to build on the question of my colleague about that clause 43 that would allow you as chief firearm officers, to both of you, to provide exemptions for the handgun ban if an individual trains, competes, or coaches in a handgun shooting discipline that is on the program of the International Paralympic Committee or Olympic Committee with some other conditions included. You said that this has already basically been in effect since October of last year with the regulations brought in. How have you, in both of your worlds, honestly, how have you navigated this, and have people been applying with you from their sport? Have your offices had the capacity to handle the applications?
Well, we have received, I'm not sure that one can actually say an application. In at least one case there is, because there isn't really a procedure established for this yet. So we have a number of people that we have tried to push through their applications, and we have not been successful in accomplishing it even once. I'm unaware of anyone anywhere who has. And these are the cases that meet the very demanding and narrow criteria in the bill, because when you talk about disciplines that are on the program of the International Olympic or Paralympic Committee, this is a tiny portion of even handgun shooting. This is maybe 1% of handgun shooting, and it appears not even that is actually being allowed. And what I think the solution really needs to be, and I'm quite sure that we would find the resources to do this because our provincial government is supportive of the firearms community, would be to give CFOs greater discretion to designate which kind of organizations could issue those kind of letters. Ideally, we wouldn't need that, but if we are going to move to a more regimented procedure, I don't think it should be one that gives the false image that no one is being affected because they've allowed for this, when even if it were allowed, it's only maybe 1% of the handgun target shooting, and in practice, so far at least, not even that.
And what's your denial? What's coming to you? What is the a letter, correspondence? What's the denial?
We don't even get that far. Like,
Thank you.
we put these things in and say, well, we need to do this, and there's no response.
And we've had exactly the same. I won't repeat it all, but we've sent in the same exemption requests to the registrar to allow people to have firearms specifically for Olympic target shooting. And we have not been able to get any paperwork pushed through. And we've even had our lawyer, Mr. Bevan, have sent formal letters, but they refuse to send a refusal because then the individual can go and file an application and to court to have it overturned. So we're not getting any paperwork. It's just getting sat on. And again, the point that Dr. Bryant was raising is very valid, is that I was an Olympic target shooter, but I didn't start there. I started in another sport shooting, and then I developed some skills, and they said, hey, you've got an ability to do this, and I slowly started to move up into shooting the Olympic sports. And then eventually, as my age rise went, I went off and to shoot other sports because, I wasn't able to compete in the Olympic realm anymore, but at least I had another place to go to enjoy my sport, and that's gone away. There's no way to feed into the Olympic system, and there's no way right now for us currently through the regulations. They're just refusing to pass an application.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Senator Arnott is next.
Thank you. I'm going to be very succinct here because there's some big issues that I want to point out to my colleague senators through your witness testimony here. I believe, Mr. Freberg, that the model that you've implemented in Saskatchewan, your interpretation of your mandate, is a model for all of Canada, with the pragmatic things you've done, with the education that you're working on, and all of the stakeholders, farmers, ranchers, sport shooters, hunters, trappers, and the First Nations and the Métis people. You've gone out and you've made those relationships work, and you're producing good results. My question is this. Do you believe that this one-size-fits-all approach that's incorporated in this act is appropriate, or do you believe that it would be wise for this legislation to give discretion to the chief firearms officers in each province and territory after consultation with stakeholders in the province and certainly the municipalities, both urban and rural, on how firearms should be managed in the province in that jurisdiction and how this act will be enforced in that jurisdiction? The second component of my question is this. The government of Saskatchewan has given you a mandate of $8 million to do that. That's about $7 per capita. That's a lot of money in Saskatchewan. But you've got a robust plan. It's about safety, enforcement, and education. And you're working with stakeholders to ensure public safety and responsible firearms ownership. We all know that the strength of any law is directly proportional to the consistency and quality of the enforcement. What kind of monies have been talked about by the federal government to the provincial government, how they're going to come up with the monies required to actually be successful and have enforcement in a real way, given what you've done in Saskatchewan with $8 million? That, to me, it's all about enforcement. It's no use having this act if it's not going to be enforced in a fair and appropriate manner. And that can't happen unless there's a lot of resources, nothing like what they've offered you in the past. I mean the federal government.
Well, I want to answer your last question first, if you will permit me, Mr. Chair. And it's an excellent question, Senator, and thank you so much for your compliments. We're very proud of what we've done, and we are leading the country, I think. The point that I want to talk about on the funding is our colleagues that were here earlier from the RCMP and so forth were talking about tracing and all the rest of those things. Saskatchewan never had a provincial firearms lab. The province is paying for it. We've waited 6 months for the RCMP just to get the internet connection hooked up, which we still don't have. We're waiting for the MOU from the RCMP that signs that allows us to trace the brass that's going into the center. So I take objection to the fact that there's, I'm sure people are trying, but at the end of the day, we've got a provincial government that's willing to build a provincial lab to trace firearms, and we're not getting the support. So we're not even asking for money. We're asking just for someone to turn on an internet connection and sign an MOU. So those are the type of frustrations that we see. So to your question about the financing side of it, we've been in negotiations since I took over the program in August of 2020 is when I started building it. I was appointed as the CFO by the government in 2021. We've been negotiating the contribution agreement with the federal government, and it started at $1.2 million. It eventually got bumped up to $1.5 million. and we're still negotiating, and still haven't got a contract, and we've been sending bills to them totaling $2.5 million a year. Then they say, give us a business case. Well, there's the actual costs. I mean, that's the best business case you can ever have. So I don't know how any other CFO across Canada is going to be able to negotiate a fair and equitable arrangement. I mean, they're at the mercy of what they're being offered. There's no negotiation. So to your point, is there anything in C-21 that addresses that? No. Has there been any money put forth under these programs? No. There has been work done in guns and gangs and some other initiatives. But what I'm trying to get across to the Senate today is that we need to do more on the front end. I mean, it's sure we have the kids with the issues in guns and violence, but we need to do the storage. I mean, these firearms are quoted about 69% firearms. Those aren't handguns. If you start drilling down on those numbers, you're going to find out they're rifles and shotguns that aren't being stored properly. We need to fix that problem, and that's what we're focusing on in Saskatchewan, and we've been extremely successful in doing so.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Mr. Freberg. We go now to Senator Boisvenu, followed by Senators Beam, Youssef and Kuchar. Senator Boisvenu.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Madame Bryan, d'abord, je veux vous féliciter pour votre français impeccable. Ma question concerne une déclaration que vous avez faite par rapport à votre inquiétude sur l'avenir du contrôle des armes à feu au Canada. Et je vous cite, « Le projet de loi C-21 continue de saper la confiance de notre système de contrôle des armes à feu, tout en ne réduisant en rien l'utilisation abusive et violente des armes à feu. » Pouvez-vous m'expliquer votre raisonnement?
Oui. Je crois que dans tous les domaines, pas seulement les armes à feu, il faut avoir la confiance du grand public et surtout de ceux qui sont touchés par une loi ou une réglementation. Et quand cette confiance est endommagée et menacée, on perd cette relation, ce rapport qui est absolument nécessaire pour non seulement conformer à la loi, mais aller au-delà de la loi. Par exemple, dans l'entreposage des armes à feu, on ne doit pas simplement avoir des dispositifs et des mesures de sécurité qui satisfont à la loi. Il faut aller au-delà de la loi. Et cela est possible seulement s'il y a un rapport de confiance entre les autorités et le grand public. Et ces mesures sapent cette confiance et c'est pourquoi je crois qu'ils minent la sécurité publique parce que sans confiance, il n'y a pas de sécurité publique.
Thank you, Chair.
I omitted to mention Senator Duncan, so Senator Duncan is next, followed by Senators Beam, Youssef and Kuchar.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the witnesses that are here today. My question is very direct for Dr. Bryant. Are you the CFO for the Northwest Territories?
No.
Do you know who is?
Yes.
Can you tell me that?
Yes. So the Alberta office, I understand your confusion. The office used to be, the Alberta office used to be responsible for the Northwest Territories. When we converted from being a federal office to a provincial office, of course, a provincial office couldn't manage a federal territory. So the headquarters of the federal office for the Northwest Territories is actually in the same building where we are, just a different floor. And the previous Chief Firearms Officer for the combined territories of Alberta and Northwest Territories is now the CFO for the Northwest Territories, Jennifer Hart McDonald. And I'd be happy to provide you with contact information for her.
Thank you very much, and I'll direct a written question to her. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Senator Beam.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to both our witnesses for being here and listening to the questions being posed by my colleagues. I'm wondering whether you have any commentary on some of the jurisdictional issues. By that I mean, is there a good data sharing relationship between you as CFOs, between each other? Is that even required? Is it there with the federal government as well? Is there a trend line that you might want to comment on? And in particular, the laws that are out there, and this one, if it is passed, even if amended, where would that fit in terms of any data sharing and jurisdictional consultation? You mentioned earlier that there was no consultation on this bill, so that's what has prompted me to ask about the other areas.
So, when we talk about data sharing, I would say, so we're actually required, mandated by law, to report on many of the things, how many of these authorizations or these licenses we issue and so on. There are a couple of areas where there are gaps there, but they're very small, very minor parts of our activities. So essentially, we report everything to the federal government. And then there's at least a subset of those statistics that are reported in the report of the Commissioner of Firearms, which comes out every year. And there are tables in there that will, for example, provide a number of revocations by province and that sort of thing. We do not, so the information sharing is largely from us up. There's very little that comes the other way. I would also say that we do have opportunities to share experiences. So CFO Freberg and I knew each other before we became CFOs. We probably talk every week informally about different issues. One of the things that is a very important part of what I do, I work 7 days a week, virtually every week. I work 5 days a week in the office, and I spend virtually every weekend doing outreach. I attend gun shows, I attend shooting competitions, I reach all kinds of other organizations. Also during the week, I often address, for example, annual general meetings of fish and game clubs and things like that. So we have a very extensive outreach program. So it's not only our colleagues in Saskatchewan, but we share many of the same philosophies. And so we exchange that opportunities.
Other CFOs? I mean,
yes,
I'm
coming. I'm just about to. That was my very next point.
Okay.
That twice a year we have conferences. So I will actually be back in Ottawa, November, I think 20th to 22nd, around then, and we meet with all of the other CFOs. We also consult on issues of importance that are of a more urgent nature. We'll just send out an email and, we've had this problem. Do you have the same thing? How are you addressing it? So there is an exchange of experience. So it's not specifically data, but it is sharing our experiences.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Senator Beam. Over to Senator Youssef.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you both for being here, and equally thank you for the work you do. You're on the front lines, obviously, and I don't pretend to understand the complicatedness and the responsibility of trying to get, of course, folks to deal with the safety issue in storing, but also recognizing that the outreach to reach communities that are not necessarily in urban areas is not an easy one in the broader context. This bill, of course, have not just the issue of handgun, but it talks about other things, and I guess I'm going to be very specific. On the question of ghost guns, which is a real challenge for all of us, because there are more and more on the market, you can buy a 3D printer. Are you pleased with that provision being included in the legislation? Because this is an issue that police officers and other law enforcement people are dealing with. Is there any thoughts you have on the ghost gun provision that's now in the bill that can aid us in the efforts of how we try to deal with the access to ghost guns and, of course, many of the parts that people are securing to build ghost guns in our country?
Yeah, so,
Maybe I'll just answer that question. Just switch back and forth a little bit, give her a break. I wanted to speak on that ghost gun issue because I know there's been a lot of discussion on the ghost gun issue. In the States, there's what's called 80% lowers and uppers, which are full metal guns, and you just go in and you just make a router hole and you've got yourself a handgun or a fully functional AR-15. You put the parts on and away you go. The 3D printed guns require a lot more parts and pieces to make them operate. And they're certainly they can be built, but the people that are building them are being charged right now. I mean, we've got a couple of people in Saskatchewan as a result of our colleagues in Quebec that started a Canada-wide project and end up catching people in several provinces that were manufacturing these firearms. But that was one of the things I brought up, Senator, in my opening remarks. A lot of those prosecutions were a result of our good friends at Canada Border Services. They're able to track these parts coming in and starting to see a profile of individuals who are building a gun or other techniques that they use. My concern on the handgun freeze is that right now, people have the gun as whole, they can sell it, there's value in it, they can shoot it, they can enjoy it. But if they can't, they can certainly just strip the parts off of that gun, and there is in the legislation saying that it has to be sold to another licensed individual. But there's no serial numbers on any of those parts. So now you've actually created more parts that can eventually build more 3D guns, because you need the metal barrel, you need the metal slide, you need the trigger mechanisms and so forth in order to make that 3D plastic gun work. And so, I think could there be more done on the 3D printed legislation? Maybe some tweaking in there to make it a little tighter. But right now, there's prosecutions. There's people in jail right now in Saskatchewan that can't even get bail who have built 3D guns. So, and again, they weren't building them to distribute. I don't believe there was more, they claim they did it out of curiosity. They wanted to build a gun. That'll be up for the courts to decide. It was still illegal. And they're in jail without bail. So I think there is certainly a legal framework right now to deal with 3D printed guns without bringing C-21 to the fold.
But my point is, there are provisions in the bill that actually strengthens the hands of law enforcement, people like yourself and others who are dealing with this. So that was my question.
Yes. And to that point, I agree with that.
So let me ask you another question, because I've heard this in
Senator,
different testimony. Sorry.
We've run out of time. I'm
Okay.
afraid we have to move on. Senator Kuchar is next, and our final question will come from Senator Daska, who I've added to the list, and then we'll draw a line under it. So, Senator Kuchar.
I have a fascinating question to ask, but I'm going to cede my time to Senator Youssef because he was on a roll.
I just want to add, because I've heard this testimony by yours, and I read your testimony, Dr. Bryant, in the other place, that you've talked about family heirlooms, and I'm struggling, and please excuse my ignorance, because I don't necessarily know what a family heirloom are or is. And is there a way you can characterize very quickly, succinctly, that help me understand what you would describe? I know not everything is a family heirloom, but there's obviously some thinking in your capacity about what this might be.
So, I can give you a personal example. So, my great-grandfather was a handgun owner. My grandfather was a handgun owner. I have a picture of him, which I use in my displays quite frequently, of him on an indoor range in the 1950s. My father was a handgun owner, and I am a handgun owner. And we have firearms that have been handed down, and I even have pictures of these individuals with these guns. So that's an example, one example of an heirloom. Another example is, for example, something that someone's perhaps father brought back or grandfather brought back from World War II, and it was a souvenir of his time in the war, and that firearm has been continued to be used in the family. More broadly, I speak to many people. Remember, Alberta is not the same as downtown Toronto. There are people who live by the old style of ranching. There are real cowboys in Alberta. I have one who works for me. And so, these are people whose grandfather settled the land and, carried a handgun with him in the early days when it was legal, to deal with predators perhaps attacking his cattle, and then that handgun has been passed on through the generations. And so these items mean a great deal to people, and it is devastating to them to think that they will be the last generation to own these.
Thank you. Senator Dasko, you have the final question.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. My question is to Mr. Freberg. Saskatchewan has some of the highest rates in the country of gun homicide and violence. Both in 2020 and 21, the highest rate of gun homicides was in Saskatchewan, and in 22, Saskatchewan was the second province with the highest rate. And gun-related crimes are extremely high in Regina. In 2020 and 21, Regina has rated perhaps the highest in the country. So couldn't a reasonable person like me and others conclude that there are too many guns in Saskatchewan? I guess my question would be, how would you explain these data to anyone? Thank you.
Thank you for your question, and I appreciate the statistics that you put through, because they speak volumes. When we look at the firearms in Saskatchewan that are being used in these terrible tragedies that you're seeing, and we go to the police agencies and so forth, and actually right now we're actually going to be starting to inventory those firearms from those police agencies to use in our provincial lab. So we're actually going to be using them for our lab needs these firearms in order to operate. What we're seeing is it's long guns that are being modified. It's long guns, single shots, bolt action rifles, shotguns and so forth that are being modified, cut down. That's primarily what we're seeing. And we also recognize, and as was mentioned earlier, some of these earlier model firearms they were from the 50s, didn't even have a serial number on them, which is why we're really focusing our efforts on making sure that our firearms community is locking up their firearms safely, that they're licensed, and that they're following the rules. So what we did to make that work, which isn't being done anywhere else in the country, right, but they will be doing it shortly in Alberta as well, is we brought in the Sask Firearms Act. So what we did is we brought in legislation there that allows for the police to lay a charge that's not a criminal charge for things like unsafe storage, not having a license, not storing it properly in your vehicle, leaving it in the back seat of your truck or whatever on a hunting trip, and then getting it stolen, because those are the ones that are getting diverted and going into these crimes that you're seeing in Regina and Saskatoon and elsewhere. Or the tragedy that we had up in Laloche with the young fellow who went into the school and shot. It was a shotgun that was left in a house with no trigger lock, no ammunition, and no one in the home had a license. So that's why we're working with partners to say, well, we need to change that paradigm, because this handgun ban isn't the issue. I mean, it's not the handguns that are getting stolen in Saskatchewan. Most of the firearms owners there are locking them up, especially now, because they can't get another one. So there are even more alarm systems, all the rest of the things that go around there. So we want to focus on the education side and then use our firearms legislation to make it easier for police to lay a charge. When they lay that charge, Mr. Bevan behind me now and our other team is going to be taking that charge over. We're going to be prosecuting it. But we're not going to be prosecuting it trying to put somebody in jail. We're going to prosecute it with alternative measures, education, send them back to school. Maybe they get an inspection. They have to have a safe put in their house. And if the next time they mess up, they're going to lose their guns completely. But the police are willing to lay those type of charges because it's not going to take them years. They can simply just lay the ticket and we'll deal with it in some fashion. And if the person doesn't want to comply, then we're going to refuse their license and they're going to get a $5,000 fine. But it's much better to try to do that through some education process, which is why we have this legislation that we've brought in recently. So we're hoping that will help with that issue, because it is a big concern to me.
So through greater safety of the gun owners, you think you can solve the problem?
If you can stop people from being able to steal those firearms, because they're certainly not going into a store with a PAL or an RPAL and buying them. I mean, they're either getting them through, some other illicit manner, but in Saskatchewan and other areas, it's predominantly the long guns that are being modified that we're seeing coming out on the street in those tragedies that you're seeing.
Chair, I think it's important to clarify, those are the correct statistics. Who is behind those crimes? It's the gangs.
And unlicensed gun owners.
So what I'm trying to get at is that it's really a significant gang activity in Saskatchewan, drugs, et cetera.
Gang-related, that's what we've always been saying. It's not the legal guys, it's the
Correct.
gang-related.
Correct.
The
I
bill
want that
doesn't
on
do
the
anything.
record.
All right,
Bill does
colleagues.
nothing to combat that.
Okay, colleagues, this brings us to the end of the panel. I want to thank Dr. Bryan and Dr. Bryant and Mr. Freberg for your help, for your advice, and for the work that you do every day. And in your case, it is every day. We've learned today. You've helped us considerably, and I also want to thank our committee members around the table for bringing the best of every witness who's been before us today. It's been a very important day of learning for us. Before we adjourn, colleagues, I'd like to bring to your attention a draft report that was sent to you on Friday from our Subcommittee on Veterans Affairs, which has completed the study on emerging treatments for veterans suffering from occupational stress injuries. Yeah, we can suspend now. Yeah, let's suspend briefly now.